When Silas was 4 years old, his father disappeared deep into the Olympic National Forest in Washington state and never returned. They said he had gotten lost during a storm, that the forest had swallowed him up as it did so many others who ventured beyond the marked trails. But his mother, Martha, knew the truth. His father hadn't gotten lost. He had chosen the forest, as he had always known he would one day. Martha couldn't entirely blame him. The forest had been in the family's blood for generations. Silas's grandfather had been a lumberjack, as had his great-grandfather and all the men before him, going back to the first settlers who arrived in the Pacific Northwest with axes in their hands and dreams of wood in their hearts. But something had changed in Silas's father in recent years. He had begun spending more time alone among the trees, returning home with distant eyes and strange words on his lips. He spoke of the trees as if they were old friends, of the streams as if they sang songs only he could hear. Then, one cold October morning, he simply didn't come back. Martha did what she could. She worked double shifts at the only supermarket in the small town of Forks, cleaned houses on weekends, sewed clothes at night under the dim light of a flickering lamp. But it was never enough. The cabin where they lived was 3 miles from town, accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud during the rainy months. There was no reliable electricity, no heating beyond the fireplace, nothing but the forest pressing against the windows like a living presence. Silas grew up in that cabin between the forest and the world of men, belonging to neither. While other children went to school, he wandered the muddy trails, learning the secrets the forest whispered to those patient enough to listen. He learned to recognize the red cedar by the sweet smell of its bark, to identify the Douglas fir by the unique texture of its needles. He discovered where the moose fed at dawn, where the bears fished for salmon in the autumn, where the crows gathered to tell their hoarse secrets. The forest became their classroom, their church, their true home. At 12 years old, Silas was already taller than his mother, with broad shoulders that promised the strength of his ancestors. It was then that he found his father's axe, buried under a pile of rotting leaves near an old stump. The handle was worn from use, the blade rusty but still solid. He cleaned it reverently, sharpened it on a stone from the stream, and began to work. At first, they were just small branches, firewood for the fireplace that warmed the cabin on cold nights. But Silas had a gift. His strikes were precise, economical, each movement an ancient dance that his body knew without ever having learned it. The trees seemed to lean towards him, offering their dead branches, their diseased ends that needed pruning so that the forest could remain healthy. Martha watched her son with a mixture of pride and terror. She saw his father in every movement, in the way Silas tilted his head to listen to the wind, in the way his eyes wandered into the green distance. She prayed every night that the forest wouldn't take him too. At 16, Silas already had a reputation. The few residents who still lived in the cabins scattered throughout the region began to call on him when they needed firewood, when a tree threatened to fall on their houses, when they needed someone who understood the silent language of the forest. He worked for little, sometimes just for a hot meal or a few cans of food. Money never meant much to him. It was that year that he met old Thomas Brennan. Thomas owned a lumber mill operating on the edge of the national forest, a business that had once prospered but now struggled to survive amidst increasingly stringent environmental regulations and competition from large corporations. He had heard of the boy who talked to the trees, who could predict where a tree would fall before even making the first cut, who never wasted a single blow. "I need someone like you," Thomas said one rainy afternoon, meeting Silas on the trail leading to the cabin. "Someone who really understands these trees, not these city kids who only know how to push chainsaw buttons." Silas looked at the older man, at his face marked by decades of hard work and worry. "I don't work for lumber mills," he replied simply. "Why not?" "Because you don't listen. You cut without thinking. You take without giving anything back. The forest is not a supermarket. And Thomas should have been annoyed, but instead he smiled. You're just like your father. He told me the same thing years ago. Silas stopped, turning completely to face the man. Did you know my father? I knew him. We worked together for a while before he went to the forest. He was the best lumberjack I've ever seen, but he had his own ideas about how things should be done. I tried to convince him to stay, but the forest called to him louder than any salary I could offer. That night, Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in the small room he shared with his father's memories, listening to the rain drumming on the metal roof, and thought about what Thomas had said. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine that perhaps his father hadn't simply disappeared. Perhaps he had found something in the forest, something Silas didn't yet understand. At 18, after his mother finally succumbed to the lung cancer she had silently battled for 3 years, Silas accepted a job working for Thomas. Not for the reasons most people would think. He needed to understand the industry, the men who made their living from the forest, who saw the trees as commodities instead of living beings. He needed to learn their language if he ever wanted to protect what truly mattered. Thomas's lumber mill was different from the industrial operations that devastated entire forests in a matter of weeks. It was a small, almost artisanal business, focused on selective logging and sustainable management. Even so, Silas saw the mistakes. He saw how the workers chose the wrong trees, how they disrupted natural growth patterns, how their noisy machines scared away wildlife and compacted the soil. He began to make subtle changes. I would suggest different trees for cutting, those that were already diseased or whose removal would benefit the growth of the surrounding trees. He showed the other workers how to read the signs of the forest, how a leaning tree indicated weak soil, how the absence of moss on certain trunks suggested invisible diseases. Some listened to him. Most found him strange. That tall, quiet boy who spent his lunch breaks walking among the trees instead of smoking cigarettes with the others. It was during one of these breaks that Silas found the clearing. He had followed a deer through the dense forest, more out of curiosity than necessity, when the vegetation suddenly parted to reveal a perfectly defined circular space between the oldest trees he had ever seen. They were red cedars, each with trunks so wide that it would take 6 men holding hands to encircle them. Their canopies intertwined overhead, creating a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden rays that danced in the humid air. In the center of the clearing was a single stone, flat and covered in moss, with something carved into its surface. Silas approached slowly, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't explain. The markings on the stone were ancient symbols, not words exactly, but drawings that seemed to tell a story. Trees, men, an eternal cycle of growth and decay, of giving and receiving, and in the corner, almost invisible beneath layers of moss and time, he saw the initials, J.T. James Turner, his father. Silas fell to his knees, his hand trembling as he traced the worn letters. His father had been here, not just been here, but left a mark, a message. But what did it mean? Why would he have carved his initials in this hidden place, in this cathedral of ancient trees? He spent hours in that clearing until the light began to fade and he heard the distant cries of the other workers searching for him. Before leaving, he made a silent promise. He would return. He would try to understand what his father had discovered here. That night, Silas began his research. He scoured the Old Forks Public Library, reading everything he could find about the history of the forest, about the native peoples who had lived here before the settlers, about the legends and myths surrounding the ancient trees. He discovered stories about places of power, clearings where trees grew differently, where wildlife behaved strangely, where people reported feeling an ancient and conscious presence. The elders of the Quileute tribe, who still lived in some areas around the forest, had stories about these clearings. They called them places where the spirit of the forest was strongest, where the boundary between the natural world and the spirit world became blurred. They said that those who spent a lot of time in these places were beginning to change, to see the world differently, to hear voices that others could not hear. Had his father discovered one of those places? Had the forest truly spoken to him, as Martha had always feared? Silas began spending all his free time in the clearing. At first, nothing special happened. He simply sat on the carved stone, observing the patterns of light through the leaves, listening to the wind whispering among the branches. But slowly, subtly, he began to notice things. The way the squirrels always stopped at a specific tree before crossing the clearing, as if asking permission. The way the birds sang differently here, their melodies more complex, more deliberate. How the air itself seemed denser, laden with something he had no words to describe. And then, on a full moon night, when Silas decided to stay in the clearing after sunset, he finally felt it. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a knowing that arose from within him, as if it had always been there, but he had never paid attention. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that every tree in that clearing was over 1,000 years old. He knew they were connected by their roots, sharing nutrients and information through an underground network of fungi that linked them not only to each other, but to the entire surrounding forest. He knew they were conscious, not in the way humans are conscious, but in an ancient and profound way that transcended common understanding. And I knew that her father had felt that way too. In the following weeks, Silas began to change. He noticed connections that were previously invisible, saw patterns in the way the forest grew and renewed itself. When he looked at a tree, he no longer saw just wood and leaves, but its entire history, the seasons it had witnessed, the storms it had survived, the life it had sheltered. This changed the way he worked. He became even more selective about which trees to cut down, sometimes refusing to touch certain trees, even when Thomas insisted they were perfect for extraction. He argued that these trees were fundamental to the structure of the surrounding forest, and that their removal would cause a ripple effect that would damage the entire ecosystem. The other workers thought he had gone mad. Thomas, however, began to pay attention. He noticed that the areas where Silas worked recovered faster, that new trees grew healthier, and that wildlife returned in greater abundance. There was something about the boy's method that went beyond conventional forestry science. "How do you know?" Thomas asked one day as they walked through an area Silas had worked on the previous year. Where there had once been only a few carefully selected stumps, a new generation of young, vibrant and strong trees was now growing. "The forest will show me," Silas replied simply. "If you stop talking long enough to listen, it will tell you what you need to." Thomas laughed, but it was a thoughtful laugh. "Your father used to say things like that. I thought it was just poetry, a romantic way of talking about intuition and experience, but it's not that, is it?" Silas looked at the older man, considering how much he should reveal. "No," he said finally, "it's not just poetry." That's when Thomas told her the rest of the story. His father hadn't simply worked for the lumber mill. He had been part of a small, secret group of lumberjacks who believed that the relationship between humans and the forest had been broken long ago, when the first Europeans arrived with their steam-powered saws and their insatiable hunger for wood. They believed that the native peoples were right, that the forest was a living, sentient being, and that it was possible to work with it instead of against it. James had gone too far, according to Thomas. He had started talking about sacrifices, about giving something back for every tree taken, about ancient rituals that maintained the balance. The other members of the group thought he was losing his mind. When he disappeared, they assumed that the obsession had finally consumed him, but Thomas was never sure. He had seen things too in his years working in the forest. He had felt the presence that Silas now felt, and secretly, in his heart, he wondered if James hadn't discovered something real, something important that they had all forgotten. "He left something for you," Thomas said finally, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. "He asked me to keep it safe, in case something happened to him. He said to give it to you when he was old enough." Inside the box was a diary, its pages yellowed with age, covered in his father's cramped handwriting. Silas took it to the clearing that night, reading by the light of a lantern while the forest whispered around them. The diary recounted a journey of discovery and transformation. James had begun, like Silas, by noticing small things, strange connections, patterns that made no sense according to conventional science. But he had gone further. He had spent days in the forest, then weeks, delving ever deeper into the green consciousness he felt pulsing through the trees. He wrote about experiences that defied reason, moments when he saw through the eyes of a raven, feeling the wind beneath its wings, nights when he dreamed of tree roots, sensing the slow flow of nutrients and information through the network of fungi, days when he simply knew things, like where to find water during a drought, where a bear had made its den, where the forest needed help to heal. But there was also a growing fear in the final pages. James wrote about an imbalance, a wound in the forest that was growing. He called it the void, a place where trees died for no reason, where the soil became barren, where even the underground fungi withered and rotted. He believed it was caused by something more than simple logging. It was as if the very connection between life in the forest was being severed, leaving entire areas isolated and dying. The last entry was brief and urgent. "I found the source, I'll try to fix it. If I don't come back, someone will have to continue the work. The forest needs a guardian. It always has." Silas closed the diary, his heart heavy. His father hadn't abandoned the family out of madness or selfishness. He had tried to save something much greater than any of them, and apparently he had failed. Or would it? In the following weeks, Silas began searching for the void his father had described. He wandered through parts of the forest he rarely visited, using the heightened sensitivity he had developed to sense any anomaly. And eventually, he found it. It was an area about 15 miles from the clearing of ancient trees, accessible only by almost invisible animal trails. Here, the forest was dying, not in the dramatic way of a forest fire or industrial deforestation, but in a slow and insidious way. The trees were grey, their leaves withered even in the height of summer. The soil beneath your feet felt hollow, devoid of the microbial life that should have pulsed through it. There were no birdsong, no squirrels scurrying among the branches, just a dead, heavy silence. And in the center of this dead zone, there was an abandoned mining operation. Silas knew nothing about mining, but he recognized the signs of chemical contamination. Rusty barrels leaked discolored liquids onto the ground. Broken and abandoned equipment was scattered across the area. And at the center of it all, there was a deep well that descended into darkness, from which emanated a pungent smell that made his eyes burn. He understood immediately. The chemicals had penetrated the soil, poisoning the network of fungi that connected the trees. Without this connection, the trees were slowly dying from isolation and poisoning, and this was spreading, contaminating more and more of the forest. His father had tried to do something about it, and then he had disappeared. Silas spent days investigating the site, careful not to touch the obviously toxic chemicals. There were signs that someone had tried to clean up the area before, probably his father. Some of the barrels had been moved, poorly buried in shallow trenches. But it hadn't been enough. The contamination was too deep, too widespread for one person alone to handle. He needed help. But whose responsibility? The authorities. It would take them years to do anything, if anything at all. The logging company? Thomas sympathized with them, but he lacked the resources or influence to handle something of that scale. The environmentalists. Silas had never trusted them, with their romanticized ideas about nature that rarely included a real understanding of the forest. That's when he remembered Sarah. Sarah Whitmore was a biologist specializing in mycorrhizae, the symbiotic relationship between fungi and plant roots. She had appeared in Forks a few years earlier, doing research for her doctoral dissertation. Silas had met her a few times in the forest and had been impressed by her genuine knowledge and respect for the complexity of the ecosystem. She was one of the few outsiders who seemed to truly understand that the forest was more than just a collection of trees. It took 3 weeks to find her. She was now working for a Seattle-based non-profit focused on ecosystem restoration. When Silas finally managed to speak to her on the phone, briefly explaining what he had found, she didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 2 days. Don't touch anything until I arrive." Sarah arrived with a small team, an environmental chemist, a soil remediation specialist, and enough equipment to conduct a preliminary site analysis. When Silas led them to the site, Sarah remained silent for a long moment, her face pale as she absorbed the extent of the damage. "My God," she finally whispered, "this is worse than I imagined. The mycelial network is completely devastated within a radius of at least 2 kilometers. It could take decades to recover if it ever does." "Can it be fixed?" Silas asked. Sarah looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. Honestly, Silas, I've never seen anything like this. The contamination is deep and it's spreading. Every rainfall washes more chemicals into the soil, expanding the dead zone. If we don't do something soon, it could contaminate the entire aquifer." Tests confirmed the worst. The chemicals were a toxic mixture of heavy metals and industrial solvents, likely remnants of an illegal gold mining operation that had operated in the area decades ago. The operation had been shut down, but those responsible never properly cleaned up the site, simply abandoning everything when authorities started asking questions. "It's going to cost millions to properly remediate this," the remediation expert said, shaking his head. "And even then, there are no guarantees. The soil may be damaged beyond repair." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She knew people, other environmental organizations, journalists who could bring attention to the problem. If they could make it public, put pressure on the authorities, and perhaps even track down the company responsible for the original mining, there might be hope. It took 6 months, but finally the story broke. An investigative journalist from Seattle picked up the case, tracing the mining operation back to a subsidiary of a large corporation. The photos of the dead zone, contrasted with the lush forest around it, shocked people. Environmental groups mobilized. Local politicians, feeling the public pressure, began to make noise. During this time, Silas became a reluctant spokesperson. He disliked attention, public speaking, or dealing with reporters. But he was authentic, and his genuine passion for the forest was impossible to ignore. When he spoke about the trees as living, sentient beings, connected by an invisible network that humans had forgotten, people listened. "My father knew," he said in a televised interview that went viral. "He sensed when the forest began to die, and he tried to do something about it. We don't know what happened to him, but I know he didn't give up, and I won't give up either. This forest gave us everything: air, water, shelter, beauty. It's time we gave something back." Public attention forced action. The EPA took over the case, beginning a long and complicated remediation process. Millions of dollars were allocated. Experts from across the country came to help. Sarah coordinated an experimental effort to reintroduce healthy mycorrhizal fungi into the soil, creating living bridges to reconnect the isolated trees to the larger network. It was a slow and uncertain process, but gradually, very gradually, the dead zone began to show signs of life. During this process, something strange happened. Silas, spending more and more time at the remediation site, began to have vivid dreams. Dreams where he walked through the forest and saw a man in the distance, tall and broad-shouldered like his own, working among the trees. The man never turned around, never spoke, but Silas knew with absolute certainty that it was his father. In one of those dreams, more real than all the others, the man finally turned around. His face was changed, marked in ways Silas couldn't describe, as if he now partly belonged to the forest. But his eyes were kind, and he smiled. "You understand now," the vision of his father said, and his voice was like the wind through the leaves. "The forest didn't take me. I chose to stay. I chose to become part of it. Someone needed to be here, to be a bridge between the green world and the world of men. Now you can be that bridge. You can do what I couldn't finish." Silas woke up with tears in his eyes, but feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. 3 years after the discovery of the dead zone, remediation was substantially complete. The soil had been treated, the chemicals neutralized or removed, and the mycelial network was slowly re-establishing itself. Young saplings were planted where the old trees had died. It would take decades for the area to fully recover, but for the first time, there was real hope. Silas now officially worked for Sarah's organization, using his unique knowledge of the forest to identify other areas that needed attention. He had become something of a local legend, the Tree Whisperer, as some journalists called him. He didn't care about the nickname. What mattered was the work. But he still spent time in the clearing among the ancient trees, sitting on the carved stone where his father had left his mark. And sometimes on calm nights, when the moon filtered through the intertwined treetops, he felt a presence, not frightening, but comforting, as if the forest or something within it were watching, approving. One night, Silas took out his own knife and carefully, reverently, carved his own initials next to his father's. Not as a claim of ownership, but as a promise. He was the guardian now. He would continue the work. The forest had taught him everything he knew. It had shown him that all living things were connected, that what harmed one harmed all. It had taught him patience, humility, respect. It had taught him that sometimes the greatest work was not cutting, but protecting, not taking, but giving. And he had taught him that his father had never truly left him. James Turner had become part of the forest he loved, his lessons echoing through the trees, guiding the son he had left behind. As Silas walked back through the dark forest, his axe slung over his shoulder but his hands empty, he did not feel alone. The crows called in greeting, the wind whispered words he could almost understand, and beneath his feet, invisible yet omnipresent, the vast web of life pulsed and breathed, connecting all living things in an incomprehensible tapestry of shared existence. He had grown up in the forest, and the forest had taught him everything. But the most important lesson, the one his father had learned before him, was this: they did not own the forest. They belonged to it, and in serving, in protecting, in being part of the great green network, they found their true purpose. The work would never end. There would always be threats, always wounds to heal, always those who saw the forest only as a resource to be exploited, but there would also always be guardians. People like his father, like himself, who understood the ancient truth that modernity had forgotten. The forest was alive, the forest was conscious, and the forest needed protectors. Silas looked back one last time, at the clearing now invisible in the darkness. "Thank you," he whispered, not knowing for sure if he was speaking to his father, to the ancient trees, or to something greater than all of that. The wind whispered back, and for the first time, he understood completely. The answer wasn't words, but a profound feeling of connection, of belonging, of home. He smiled and continued walking, knowing that tomorrow he would wake up early, grab his axe, and do the work that needed to be done.